So Patrick, do you have any recommendations like for now, or I guess it's a little bit early to say what sectors or business areas are maybe most promising, but um, have you seen any trends
Immediate
that you?
immediate ones would be food services that are really focused on takeout and delivery, and
That's
the
true.
ones that were quick to adapt and really reallocate their marketing budgets. And sometimes they've taken in house some of the delivery features, um, as well as some of the stable ones that month over month have the same clients and are deemed essential work, like landscaping that they've been operating throughout this crisis. A few questions. Do you have sports franchises, not fitness? I'm not really sure in terms of what sports franchises. We can work with any franchise that's established. There's well over 2,000 franchises. We've looked at 1,600, but for each client, they engage our services, and we'll do a customized search for them. Okay. Is there an age limit to request? So maybe I'll turn it back to Charles to answer some of the visa related questions.
Uh, as for age limitations, so legally, I guess the person has to be 18 years old because if they're under 18, they cannot enter into any binding legal contracts, right? So somebody under 18 is not of majority age, so they can't sign any contracts that would be legally binding, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, that's the legal answer. The practical answer is I think you'd probably have a problem if you had like a 19-year-old or 18-year-old walking into the embassy for an E2 interview, just because they would really question that person's ability to properly manage the business, et cetera. So I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. The youngest we've had, I would say the person would probably have to be like mid-20s or something. Again, there's no legal restriction. This is purely subjective, intuition that a immigration officer, because part of the consideration is that person has to convince the officer that he or she is able to manage and grow the business. And if it's just a 20-year-old, kid, if you want to call them that, I could see where there would be some questions. You might be able to get by with a younger person if you did change of status here in the U.S. because, as I mentioned, there are no interviews that are done here. So I think that issue of age could come up, but if for some reason maybe that person has a really good, maybe you've got a 20-year-old wunderkind and he or she's, great, software programmer and it's already, done a couple ventures by age 20, then you might, maybe be able to make a good argument for that. For the E2, here's a question for E2. What options are there other than EB5 that leads to the green card? Good question. So you've done your homework, I think, or else you looked at my slides well. Honestly, there's no direct option to go from an E2 to a green card except through EB5. That's the only direct option. So there are other options or possibilities, but they just, how do I put it? They don't hinge on the presence of having that E2. So for example, you could come with the E2, start with doing that, and then let's say you got a job offer from somebody else, some company, they saw how great you are and they say, hey, we'll give you a job offer, we'll sponsor you for a green card, but that's going to take, probably a year and a half. So they start the process, you stay in your E2 status all that time, and then when the green card gets approved from your or for your future employer, then you can change your status. So that would work. But again, that's not contingent on you having that E2 visa. So if we're looking at anything like, okay, I get the E2, and how does that E2 get me a little bit closer to a green card? The only real option is an EB5. And again, I didn't go into that in my presentation, but what that means is you'd start like, you buy a franchise with Patrick, and you'd invest, say, 200,000, you'd have to increase that total investment amount to 900,000. So reinvest earnings, maybe expand, maybe open some other shops, buy some more franchises through that, and expand your total investment to 900,000 and create 10 new jobs. So in that case, you could do that. The applicant have to be staying in the same state for his kid to get about the education question there. To qualify for the reduced tuition, you would have to be a resident of that state. So generally, residency for children is determined by where the parents reside. So you would qualify for the reduced tuition in that state where you physically reside. The business could be in a different state. So to answer your question, you could have a business in Georgia, you live in Florida, So for purposes of education, you would qualify for reduced education in Florida. The E2 spouse permit, yes, the spouse receives employment authorization. So the spouse can work anywhere he or she would like. So the investor is tied to the business itself. He or she can't work anywhere else, but the spouse is free to work anywhere at all. Tuition fees, what level of education? We're talking just about higher education here. So this only applies to university or what's it called, community colleges, stuff like that. Now, your children who are under 18, who are just in regular school or high school, once they're in E2 status, they can go to any public school just like any other resident. So what happens if I do the franchise and the E2 is rejected? Well, I can answer part of that, and I think Patrick can mention it too, because Patrick's had some interesting scenarios on that. Yes, that is the degree of risk that you're involved in. That you've got to commit those funds, that 100,000 or more, prior. You've got to commit them or actually spend them prior to filing for the petition. And if you do get denied, yes, you might have a business then you've got to deal with. But I think Patrick, if you want to discuss, I mean, there are scenarios that are possible whereby you could get your money back.
Sure. So it really just depends on the opportunity. If you're investing in like a real estate property management franchise, it's a lot easier to allocate a lot of the funds to be subject to the E2 visa approval, where maybe you put a 10%, 20% deposit. And if you're rejected after the second attempt, you get all the money back besides 10% or 20% that would have been non-refundable for the franchisor. And then if the business is going to be a new restaurant that you're opening, there's too many commitments. You got to sign a lease with the landlord. You're going to pay the architect. You're going to have too many parties. And a lot of the best options in terms of real estate, the landlords aren't going to want to have a 4-month, 6-month window where you can back out of the contract, essentially. So it's really case by case, and we'll push to have as much contingent on the E2 visa as possible, but that generally will limit the opportunities for our clients.
Mm-hmm. One other question here, I guess somebody said, can the spouse lead to the green card? With the, it's scrolling too much. So the spouse can lead the green card. Well, the spouse, so if the spouse, again, finds some other opportunity that would allow for a green card. So for example, we've done this too before, say maybe the main investor files for an E2 because it's relatively small investment, gets them here quickly. And then the spouse files for an EB5, for example, totally different project. That's a possibility, but again, the E2 is not helping them move towards the EB5. It's just a totally separate project. They're doing that. Otherwise, yes, the spouse could file for a green card. Probably the most likely way of doing that is by what would you say? If he or she were able to find an employer who would sponsor her through employment for the green card. So you guys would have your E2. You'd be here. Maybe the spouse gets hired by a company and that company wants to sponsor him or her for a green card. Yeah, that certainly works. There was an earlier question. Somebody said the difference between an E2 and an EB1C. So the E2, again, that's a temporary visa. The length of the visa depends on what country you're from, but it's not intended to be permanent. It's not permanent residency. You basically have all the rights as a legal resident, except the fact that you're kind of limited in time that you can stay here, and you're also tied to that company. So if you're an E2 investor, you can only work for that E2 company. EB1C, as Patrick mentioned with that scenario he had, EB1C is when you get a green card. You buy a company that's large enough and it meets some other requirements. So the requirements are different for an EB1 and an E2. But if you get approval with the EB1C, you get a green card. So that means, you could sell the business after a while, doesn't affect your status, could go work somewhere else, doesn't affect your status, etc. Patrick mentioned 2 escrows on an E2 is expensive supplier for the inventory. So this is a question from Andre. Is it acceptable to have an escrow with a supplier for the inventory? Is the same 2 escrows on an E2 petition? I'm trying to think of the scenario where you do that. The short answer is yes. Yeah, you could do it. I think you could do 2 escrows. I mean, I don't think I've ever done it like that. But I think you could have 2 escrows. The main thing from immigration's perspective when they're looking at these escrows is that it's written clearly in the escrow that if there is an approval, the investor's not getting this money back. I mean, it's going for those purposes that were mentioned: purchasing the franchise license agreement, purchasing supplies, et cetera. So you probably theoretically could have multiple escrow agreements as long as it's clearly written in there that as long as the visa gets approved, that money's not going back to the investor. Okay, good question about the recently signed executive order of Trump. Yeah, good point. I forgot to mention at the outset. Good news for everybody, I would say, on today's call, because it really does not affect anyone who is applying for a non-immigrant visa. So if you're applying for an E2, L1, maybe H1B, but we're not talking about that today. The new executive order does not affect those. Now, there's other practical questions. The embassies are all closed, so you couldn't even go there if you wanted. But for non-immigrant visas, doesn't affect. The only people that it would affect for today's purposes of today's discussion is EB1C. So if you remember what Patrick mentioned, and what we discussed, if you apply for a green card, on the basis of buying a large enough company, then that would affect you under Trump's order. But as things stand right now, it's not going to affect people either, because the order is only in effect for 60 days. It's going to take much longer for you to get an approval for an EB1C for that green card. Right now, the processing times are taking 9 to 12 months. Now, okay, worst case scenario, this executive order gets extended and extended down the road for another year. Okay, at that point, theoretically, then it might be able to affect things. But as of today and how the order is written right now, the practical effect is only that it's going to affect, I would say, people immigrating through family reunification.
Charles, I think that was an awesome last question to wrap up our webinar. And I've put on your contact information for the attendees that are still on the line. And just wanted to thank everyone for joining today's webinar.
All right. Thanks so much, Patrick. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.